Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this webinar. Unfortunately, Yahia is experimenting some technical issues connecting from Germany, and we are trying to communicate him as I speak. So we appreciate that you've connected on time. We're trying to reach him, and I would like to ask for those of you who can spare some 10 additional minutes that we would try to help him connect. If it doesn't happen, we will reschedule the webinar. If it does start 10 minutes late, we will be happy to share the link to the replay of the webinar for those of you who can stay longer after 6 p.m. So thank you for your understanding, and I'll get back and try to resolve the issue with Yahia. Thank you.
Okay, I'll close this though.
Hello, everyone back, and thanks for those of you who stayed. We have 89 people. We respect your time, and we apologize that this delay happened. These things happen sometimes in webinars as well. But we're glad that you're here, and Yahia, welcome to the webinar today. On behalf of IHS Alumni International Board, thank you. So thank you for being here. Eduardo is joining from Brazil.
Yeah, hello everybody.
So
Thank you for joining. And if you have any technical issues, just let us know on the chat, please.
And my name is Janu Ramirez, and I'm joining from Warsaw, Poland. Thank you again for waiting for us. Before we start, if it's the first time that you join one of our webinars, I would like to ask you that the first section will be a half-an-hour presentation from our speaker. And then as he goes along with his presentation, you're welcome to write your comments and questions on the chat, and we'll get back to them once he finishes the presentation. So thanks again for being here. For those of you who don't know Yahia Shawkat is a researcher and also the co-founder of Tooba, which is a spatial justice research studio, and he's also the research coordinator for that studio. He has done a lot of research on legislative analysis, also specializes on data visualization and historical mapping. He's based both partly in Cairo and in Berlin, and was also nominated for the IHS Alumni International Urban Professional Awards for the 2018 edition. So thank you, Yahia, for connecting, and glad you could make it. And not to lose more time, I'll just pass it to you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be here today and presenting today's topic, which is Egypt's housing crisis. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jano, and thank you for the IHS alumni for organizing this. It's really exciting, and I apologize for these technical difficulties. Okay, I'll start straight away, and maybe I'll try and make the presentation shorter so we have more. We try and have the same time in the end for questions and answers. Okay, so today I'm going to be giving a talk about my book, which just came out over the last few weeks. It's been a long work in progress. It covers some of my work on housing rights in Egypt, other on sort of visualizing and policy analysis that I've done through Tooba, which I co-founded with Ahmed Zaza and Omnaya Khalil in 2014. So what you see, or what you're going to see, is trying to make sense of Egypt's housing policies through these different ways of either provision or regulation of the whole housing climate. So just to give you a brief overview, The book is about 7 chapters, starts with an overview about the problem itself and how and where we are today. There are 2 chapters on the regulation of housing, either amnesties for informal self-build or rent control mostly. And then 3 other chapters talk about housing provision. Early on in the 20th century, it was through model villages, and then later it became urban government housing. And then the last chapter wraps up looking at how all these different ways of regulation and provision unravel and where we are today. The book uses a number of sources, mostly laws and their explanatory notes and parliamentary reports that came with them. And this, for me, was a big treasure trove, if you will. I mean, up until maybe 2012 or 2014, I hadn't read any laws and assumed that policies were written in a place that said housing policy report and so on. But actually, laws were a very important resource because they gave a candid look at how both the executive and lawmakers saw the making of these laws and the modification of them over time. Statistics were also very important to understanding the effect of the policies, and there are quite a few reports that help give us that insight. And of course, there's articles and news reports, as well as a number of interviews I was able to conduct. Just a little moment here. So, going back to maybe the first half of the 20th century gives us a very good premise to what is happening in Egyptian housing up until today. And basically, this was the time of colonial monarchy. We see new art and literature coming out that portrays the inequities that Egyptians lived through at the time. They're rather rare accounts, but they helped form a nationalist movement. These accounts showed how landless peasants were treated by landlords. There was a big continuous struggle, mostly through the 30s and the 40s, of strikes and actions against landlords and against factory owners that ultimately culminated into the 52 revolution. One of these works was Tawfiq Hakim's Yawmiyat Naib fil Aryaf, or Diary of a Country Prosecutor. At the time the book came out, in the late 1930s, some architects picked up on it and started to address these social issues. One of these architects was Mahmoud Riyad, who in 1945 wrote what I believe to be a very early and rare policy paper on how equitable housing should look like. What's interesting here is that in Majallat al-Amara, which was the leading sort of architectural and artistic magazine of the time, almost all writing had to do with designs and with planning of cities and so on. In his article, there isn't a single diagram, and it actually compares housing policies in certain Western countries, including Britain, where he actually trained to be an architect in the 1930s, Germany and Austria, and how they were providing social housing and subsidizing housing and giving certain tax breaks, but then also progressive property taxes. And this was very interesting because nothing much happened up until 1947 when the first major government housing project broke ground in Mbeba, which was for government workers and employees just on the outside of Cairo then. And it was the first project to really take one of his policies, which is subsidizing housing to make it affordable for the workers, and put it to test. And by 1950, he was actually made Director General of the Department of Popular Homes, which was the first government office, the highest government office established to tackle housing, and which later on would become the Ministry of Housing. But this was short-lived, really, because in a couple of years, all the worker strikes and peasant actions caught up with the regime, and the monarchy was toppled. When Nasser came to power, he lost no time in scaling up these popular homes, Iskan Shadi, or social housing scheme. And in one of his speeches, he says that building popular homes would relieve Azmet al-Masakin, the homes crisis. So, whereas up until maybe that point in 1955, most people, when they talked about the problem, they called it the homes problem. And here it's also important to note that in Arabic, the word homes, masakin, was used, and not housing, which would still happen, but a decade later. And here I think is the translation from the English housing problem to Arabic, but the verb of housing was still not used then. So when he talked about Azmet al-Masakin, he also changed something here from a housing problem to a housing crisis. And that for me is very telling because in all official documents, like the slide you see on the right comes from a law issued in 1956, giving amnesty to informal builders. The Minister of Municipal and Village Affairs also used homes crisis, and so not a homes problem. And so it tells me that there is a conscious use of a term to describe something, and that this policy is being written very consciously to have certain meanings. Very quickly, popular housing started being built in many different areas. We see big newspaper reports, full page, half page, talking about how housing is being built. But alas, all this housing isn't necessarily going to the poor or to actually population increase. A lot of it went to emergency shelter. Tens of thousands of people were displaced in the 56 and 67 wars with Israel and had to be rehoused. About 50,000 Nubians were displaced for the building of the High Dam and had to be housed. So a lot of this housing was replacing existing housing and not actually adding to the housing stock. Many other housing projects were going to the middle class and not the poor. So ultimately, people still talked about a housing crisis or a homes crisis throughout the 1960s. And we find a very interesting parliamentary debate in which Abdel Nasser says that each one of you, talking to the parliamentary committee of the Arab Socialist Union, each one of you wants to solve the housing crisis. But can we really solve the housing crisis in 1 year, 3, 4, or 5? And this is the second etymological change in Nasser's era, and the first time the word housing rather than homes is used in Arabic. So now it becomes from Azmet al-Masakin into Azmet al-Iskan, and the word iskan or housing as a verb will remain in use up until today. Films were also quick to portray these changes and challenges. and mostly in a comical sense. So one of these is Shaqqa Mafrusha, which means furnished rental apartment, that was produced in 1960. And the first 15 minutes of it is the star trying to look, spending a whole day being driven around in a taxi cab, trying to look for an apartment that is either vacant or that she can afford. In the 1972 film Esme Second, which was very straightforward in its title, as you can see, the Homes Crisis, another star, also a woman, is eagerly looking for a home, and it really shows what a single woman had to go through in Cairo at the time to be able to find a place. Moving into the 1970s, a lot of things changed, but a lot of others didn't. Sadat, who succeeded Nasser from 1970, started taking apart the socialist state, and in 1974 initiated Infitah, or liberal open door policy, steering Egypt away from the east and towards the west. In doing so, a number of policies were enacted that liberalized the economy, and most of them were not accepted by Egyptians at the time, culminating in the 1977 bread riots. And one of the chants, interestingly, was هو بيلبس آخر موضة وإحنا بنسكن 10 في أوضة. So he wears the latest fashion while we live 10 to a room. So even in the chants, the housing problem was at the forefront. And even by 1981, Muhib Ramzi Stino, who was head of the Parliamentary Housing Committee then, talked about the housing crisis continuing uninterrupted from 1960 up until today. So for two entire decades. Sadat wouldn't have any of that, though. He was very keen on using another term, the housing problem. And this we find in many of his speeches and statements, except one, which is in the picture you see here when he lays the cornerstone for what would be the first new desert town to be built that would be part of a large main government program to build these cities from scratch in the desert, and where he says that new cities will eliminate the housing crisis and relieve it from the widest of doors. And here I find that it might be just a slip, and he didn't mean to use the word housing crisis, because in the same speech he also uses the words housing problem. And this we also find in his ministers of housing almost without exception. For example, Osman Ahmed Osman, who is also a construction tycoon, and his in-law, says in one of the explanatory notes for a law that would establish the Economic Housing Fund, the housing problem is one of the main problems that touches the lives of all people and requires a great deal of investment to remedy. And here the word investment also becomes very important and very problematic, because a year later they enact a law that actually makes public housing for sale and not for rent, and hereby beating Margaret Thatcher by 2 years on her right to buy scheme. But then they would also go one up on that, because it wasn't just existing government housing that was built from the 50s that would be sold to tenants, but also all new government housing would be sold, and this would be the mainstay of government-built housing up until today. Overnight, this so-called public housing, where I really refuse the term, to use that term, this government housing becomes many times more expensive, and thereby keeping the poor out. And so film continues to also portray this now housing problem. Because also along with the open door free market policies, it was also a free for all for a lot of unscrupulous developers who would sell the same unit twice to two different people, and there was a host of court cases where people found out that they bought flats that were already sold. And one of the films, which is, oh, I'm sorry, the caption is wrong at the bottom. Garib fi Beiti, Stranger in My Home, talks about a school teacher and mother and single mother who buys this apartment, finds out that she is a co-owner or a contested owner with a rising football star, Noor Sharif. And in the scene we see here is how they actually decided to divide the apartment and keep living in it because of how bad the housing crisis is. In another film, about 4 years later, movie star Adil Imam portrays someone who goes through almost the entire spectrum of housing problems in Egypt at the time. So he starts by losing his original home to building collapse and having to seek refuge with his family in a government sort of makeshift camp, and then apply for government housing that doesn't come through, and then have to go and crowd with his brother-in-law who isn't very welcoming. So this all pushes him, an architect in the film, to build a caravan that he uses a donkey to drive around different parts of Cairo. And the reason the film is called Karakun Fashera, or Prison in the Street, is that this makes him end up being arrested every time he parks in a different place because this is illegal. So what happens in the end is that he is with a group of fellow caravanners who go and squat vacant desert land, and the police show up to evict them. But in the last minute, they get a phone call, supposedly from high up, from the president himself, or the allusion is, and to stop the eviction and allow them to build. And here, I think, is one of the rare occasions where a film shows how the government, or what the government discourse is, and it's actually a very direct, not even tacit approval of land squatting that is also mirrored by the amnesty laws that were between 1956 and 1986, when the film was released. About 8 different amnesties for squatting were given. Moving to 1991, this is a very big turning point in Egypt's policies towards housing. The World Bank and the IMF initiated their structural adjustment package that was supposed to open Egypt up more to foreign and Western markets. Excuse me. And one of the first housing policies to change was rent control. And we find that in the parliamentary report, for the first time, an actor other than municipalities, of course, political parties, experts, and so on, as part of it, it's the Egyptian Businessmen Association, which says of itself that it is a lobbying arm for the lead businesses in Egypt. And they were sitting on the committee changing the law, which, to no surprise, the committee head writes in his report that the law removes the barriers that prevent the private sector from investing in housing to confront the housing problem. And here we find that the word housing problem that was coined under Sadat remains pretty much under Mubarak, and all the way till today, in the rare occasions we find it used. Mubarak's housing minister at the time, Ibrahim Suleiman, in '98, said that there is an importance for the role of the private sector in solving the housing problem. So here we see another shift away from the government building housing and the responsibility being for the private sector to do so. Of course, there doesn't come any regulation on prices and so on, but then the government also didn't impose regulations on pricing housing that it built. By the year 2000, the third change would come when Hosni Mubarak, in a parliamentary address, talks about a new mortgage law being initiated, or being passed, again to help in solving the housing problem. But there's a little problem for us, is that films by the 1990s had stopped talking about the housing problem or tackling it in any significant or direct way. But then this kind of blackout doesn't just happen in cinema, it also happens in official documents. By the end of the 1990s, laws stopped coming with explanatory notes and parliamentary reports that explained what they were about or how they got there. So it's been very hard to try and track the official discourse through them. So here we can shift to something else, and is trying to map this change over time. And at the top of this graph, you see pictures of Egypt's rulers from King Farouk all the way to President Abdel Fattah Sisi, giving deeds to new owners of housing. And this is really striking, is that one certain housing policy remains a mainstay of regimes, whether they are liberal, socialist, liberal again, or neoliberal. The government giving housing to citizens is a very important part of how it works. The discourse did change, but the change also reflects the changes in policy. And here we see these boxes in different shades of gray that give a very loose interpretation of what happens with these policies over time. So you have maybe three main avenues to these policies: the regulation of the market, the provision, the direct provision, and in between there's a sort of hybrid regulation provision. So the regulation is mainly seen through rent control that starts in the 1940s, is heavily enforced in the 50s and 60s, starts to wane by the 1980s, and by the 1990s is abolished. But whoever is still living in rent control still keep their flat, so that's why it remains a light gray. The second thing is amnesty for informal construction, which starts in the 1950s and is very much enacted up until the 1980s, and then indirectly in the 1990s up until 2019, when the 9th installment of such an amnesty has been passed, but we still don't know the consequences of it quite yet. The hybrid regulation provision is the workers' housing or cooperative housing, where the government co-builds or helps groups to build housing through subsidized materials, subsidized land, and so on. And again, we see most of that happening in the socialist period, and then sort of remaining a bit in the 1970s, and then waning off. Direct provision, however, is the one main thing that remains. Rural housing dies off by the 70s or 80s as a major form of housing provision, but social housing remains, and actually there is a recent resurgence. Using the statistics to try and explain this gives us, or actually tells us a similar story with a couple of twists. In the bottom, in the dark gray on the bars, you see the government housing provision. So by the 1960s, it went up from near zero, probably in the 1940s, to about 12% of urban housing production. So such a big push. But then it remains the same throughout the next couple of decades that are mostly liberal, and actually more than doubles in the 86-96 period before it falls due to structural adjustment. But then again, it doesn't really disappear, it just falls to 10%, its lowest in these 6 decades, and then rises a bit over the last decade. So it really is a very resilient form of housing. At the top, you have the medium gray, which is self-built housing. And you see how it starts in the 1960s to be the major form of housing provision. But actually, it is the most popular, except for the 76-86 decade, where it shares with the form of private sector, which is the lighter gray in the middle. And here, my belief is that a lot of what was supposedly informal was seen or recognized as formal, and hence this very big jump of the formal private sector, and then very quick drop again. And today, it's about a quarter of urban housing production. Tenure is also important to tell this story of policy change. So again, in this graph, you see in the bottom, the dark gray starts in 1976, where rent control is the most popular form of housing. About 2/3 of urban Egyptians live in rent control apartments by 1976, of course, based on legislation that was passed in the 40s and 50s and 60s. At the top, in the big light gray, the 35%, that's self-built housing. Part of it is inherited according to the statistics, so it's a mix, but I think most of it, or the majority of it, is the self-built housing. And the very small medium gray at the top, the less than 2% you see there, is the market housing, is when people bought housing for their own use. And this is the most interesting part, because in most literature that you read, whether by experts, international agencies, anyone talking about a housing market in Egypt talks about this very, very small bar. Of course, that part of the market grows over time very steadily. But even today, in 2017, when the census, last census came out, it's only 20% of the urban housing market. If you add the rural market or rural housing, this would drop to probably 10%, because in villages, people still build for themselves. So this is really a very small part of the market. Mostly, until today, with all these policies that we've seen, self-built housing remains the most popular, and it has even grown to about 47%. So ownership overall, if we add the top two bars, is now about 2/3. So it's really replaced rent control from 4 or 5 decades ago as being the most popular form of tenure. And in the bottom, the dark part, that's the rent control. So it's really dying out. And I expect by the next census in 2027, or whenever it's held, we're going to see very, very little rent control left, and even very little rent. So the one on top of it is the market rent that was introduced in 1996, and we see it's barely above 11%, and I doubt it will grow much over the next decade. So to wrap up, what we've seen, especially from these last statistics, is that Egypt is per capita the biggest housing producer in the world. So this really begs the question, why is there a housing crisis? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yahia. You made a very important question. You will have to answer your own question, I guess. So thank you for all of you who stayed. It's been a pleasure having Yahia here. And we do have some questions already posted. And if that's fine, I would like to start with James from South Africa, who is asking what has been the role and potential of technologies in addressing housing stock availability and property markets shifts?
I think technology is really taking a back seat here to policies.
Sorry,
The,
Yahia, we lost you in video. Or are you?
yeah, no, I'm trying to get back. It's telling me there's something wrong with the video.
Okay, but we can hear
Once
you.
it
That's
wakes up,
fine. Thanks.
I'll come back in. So I think to answer the question is that any technical, let's say, address or response to the housing crisis really takes a backseat to policy and the kind of legislative climate we have. So, and this is from early on. I mean, I've read very, very good reports from going back from the 60s and 70s about the housing problem and how it should be addressed, and some very good advice. But this advice has never been taken properly because of the structural kind of dysfunction of how housing policy works.
I'm just putting, Yano, your microphone is off.
Thank you very much. From MA Bayo, in the early 80s, a committee realized that people needs for homes outstripped government plans, and that has led to the production of buildings without permits. Is it only about government's plan or capacity to provide housing, or at least promote its provision?
Yes, that's the key. It's the promotion of the provision. So you find this in most government policies from the 1960s up until today. It's either the government provides the housing or the private sector provides the housing in terms of the written policy or the laws passed. But you find very, very little in terms of encouraging communities to build, or this self-building or this social production of habitat. So, and this is really the main criticism of many critics that you read also again from the 70s or 80s till today, saying that the government should recognize this potential and cater to it rather than demonize it.
Your microphone again, Jano.
Too many meetings today. Apologies. How do you see the future of housing in Egypt, considering how things are going in the present?
I think it will remain very challenging. I think the housing problem crisis, put the word you'd like to put in, is going to stay. Today, the main crisis is a crisis of affordability. Finding an adequate house that meets your basic needs that you're able to afford, and this is going to be the main challenge for the future.
And also one related to COVID and what's going to be the impact of COVID-19 on the housing market in Egypt. I know in Holland as well, we're facing extra housing shortage as a result of no new housing being built these last 6 months.
I think the problem isn't going to be a shortage because we already have about 30% vacancy. So if we put all the tools down and run out of cement overnight, we'll still have housing to cover needs for possibly the next 10 years. So the problem isn't the production, but it is putting people in this vacant housing. So we need laws that force them or entice them to be rented out. We need to see more of that, or maybe some of the housing is too remote and would need other kind of provision to make it livable. But the main problem we've seen with COVID is a very sharp drop in incomes because a lot of people have been let go and a lot of businesses have closed. And this mainly has affected tenants and renters. And this is really the main issue, is how you can subsidize or support them so they don't lose their homes.
Thank you, Yahya. Laila is saying, when can you say that the crisis is over?
I think it depends who you are. If you're the government, you've already said the crisis is over about 30 years ago and only talk about a problem. If you're an activist or an expert trying to help out, then it's still there. I think the point where we can say it is over, or at least manageable. I don't think it will ever be completely over, but in a sense where it becomes manageable is that when we see overall affordability rates becoming much better than they are now. So, for example, in 2016, we did a study that showed about 50% of Egyptians could not buy or rent a median-priced home. So this really had to change, and that number or the affordability itself has to improve.
Eduardo, do you want to read some of them, or should I? Because there's one from Maya, and she's asking higher incomes or distant locations. Do you think people will be tending more towards renting versus self-building?
I don't understand the relation between the incomes and the self-building.
Maybe Maya, you can explain a little bit more.
Yeah.
And
we also have a lot of comments saying how they like the presentation, and this is good, of course. And we also would like to clarify that Asada Stefan already put where we will share the replay link. So after the session, you can also rewatch it, or people who by any chance lost something, or anyway, the replay link is going to be there too.
There's a very important comment that Sylvia will buy your book. So,
yeah.
So remember, everyone who joined, we still have 84 people joining us, and this is part of Yahia's book. We highly encourage you to. This is our commercial. He's not asking us to say this, but if you enjoyed this first chapter of the book, I'm sure you will enjoy the rest. And we have another question. How do you see the housing restructuring plans of Cairo?
I think if the question means the building of new towns or new government housing, I would say it's a very interesting point in time where either the history repeats itself and all this housing will remain empty for the foreseeable future, and it's just part of this financialization of housing and building empty apartments. Or something may change, and actually the people that have invested in this housing, because there is now an unprecedented amount being built, that will actually have to be sold, and this would bring house prices down. So I think within the next couple of years, we might see a big change, and we might see that the property market actually becomes more affordable.
There is also a question where they can buy the book. There is online, or in Egypt, there is a place where they can find the book.
I've been told that, so it's out already in the US. It's supposed to be out in the UK and Europe, I think, by next month, and in Egypt by November. So hopefully soon.
But they can buy it online already. Is that correct?
No, it's not going to get shipped.
No? Okay.
Not easy. Yeah.
So there's another one, and in addressing the need for housing for the poor or underprivileged, what is the percentage in the housing production being produced by the government versus the production by the private sector developers? Are all these government housing for the poor free grants?
No, absolutely not. Like what I showed, I think in the last slide, that government housing was about 11% of production on average over the last 10 years. So probably by now the government builds about 200,000 housing units a year. Half of those are social housing units, and the other half are market units, so they're sold on the market. But even those social housing units are expensive or complicated to get in because you need to be an employee, better a government employee or a private sector employee that has a fixed salary so that you are able to qualify for a mortgage. But then this is about maybe 30% of the workforce. The rest have to get all these different documents to prove their income, which makes it harder and makes it them higher risk for banks that in many cases refuse to give them loans.
Thank you, Yahya. We have Farah asking, do you believe that the design helped in creating the problem? And can it be a tool for solutions along the policies or not?
Um, well, let's assume if design of the housing itself, I don't think so. I mean, there's really bad designs that can still be passable housing, but the thing is to actually get to them. So so ultimately, again, it would be the policies that allow you or that are between you and finding housing. Design will always be solved. I mean, maybe part of design or some more work can go into bringing costs down a bit. But this we've seen in how self-builders have really honed their skills in making building housing very efficiently compared to big companies and even government companies building housing.
You have your microphone off, Eduardo.
Now it's my turn to do the same
Yes,
mistake.
yes.
So we have a question here from our colleague Charmay. How do you see the role of academic and
Hi.
educational institutions in contributing to the discussion of addressing the housing crisis in Egypt?
I mean, any debate on it is definitely going to be an addition, especially that now we see more and more people, whether architects or even now interdisciplinary work, coming into looking at housing and how it's dealt with. I think the more debate there is, and the more people that come in to talk about it, the more solutions or avenues we're able to find.
And there's one from Michael. Are we able to get an Africanized solution to housing in Africa, at least by bringing researchers together to undertake such a study?
I think again, I would say that the main problem would still be these policies that we try and enact in different African countries that are very much not placed into reality or what needs to be done. So if we are talking about Africanized solutions or designs, well, we can always go to communities that have designed for themselves. So architects and planners are still very much wedded to maybe Western or foreign schools of thought, but communities are not. And I think this is what really needs to be embraced: is that we need to study communities more and understand how they build for themselves in order to, if we have a chance, to develop our own housing identity.
Thank you. I think I haven't read this one. Just let me know if I did. Brita is asking, what impact will the recent reconciliation law and its enforcement have on the housing situation and urban development in Egypt in general?
This is a very good question, and this is still happening. So the reconciliation law is actually uh, about to be finished, or the deadline is in 6 days. And here's a very big turning point, because the government so far has said that anyone who hasn't applied will have the house demolished, or at least made um, unsaleable, or so there's going to be a very detrimental effect on homes that have not applied for this reconciliation. And our statistics show that maybe we're talking about 8 million homes or more that may be under this law. and so far about 2.5 million have applied. So it's going to be a very, very big test to see if the government backtracks and extends the deadline. If not, is it going to demolish buildings? There is a very vague promise that they might not demolish homes that are already lived in, but then life is going to be hard or remain hard for people that remain in them. So yeah, this is going to be a very big change, and over the next few months, we have to keep our eyes on it and see what happens.
Okay, we continue to receive some questions here, and if by any chance we lost your question or comment, I can also show again the slides with Yahia's contact information, and of course you can also contact him and clarify. We have this question of hand. In a situation where finalization of housing is dominating and the state itself is considered to be real estate speculative, how can we make a transition from that situation to regard housing as a basic right?
Well, that's a tough question. Well, the irony is that for the first time in Egypt's history, the 2014 constitution has actually added an article that upholds the right to housing. So on the local level, we have it in the constitution. Egypt is party to many conventions that uphold housing rights. So on a theoretical level, it is there. The problem is making that transition from legislation to on the ground policy.
And then we have also one from Julia.
Oh,
And
yes.
how is the process in providing land for housing that is provided by the government? Does the land owned by the government, or does government purchase the land? Also, could you explain more on how the rent control mechanism works?
Well, Egypt is relatively peculiar in the sense that there is a lot of vacant desert land. We are told time and again how we live on a very small part of it, 5, 6, 7%, and the rest is vacant desert that should be used and people should move to. So this is all state-owned land that is sold to developers. But what happens is when it's sold within the jurisdiction of these so-called new cities, these desert towns that are given designated areas and where building or development happens within them. And this, of course, makes it a commodity because then it is very controlled, it is very centralized. So all along Egypt's different governorates. So far, most cities have twinned with the capital, with the provinces, and even then have not become extensions of these cities, but they're mostly remote, and they take years to start up. So, and in some cases now, some of the new cities are 100% gated communities. So the land there and the developers operating there, the land is very expensive and the developments are very unaffordable. So this is something that has to be addressed. So ironically, even though there is supposedly an unlimited supply of land, this kind of limitation of it through planning has made it expensive. In terms of rent control, well, the legislation that is around today can be maybe traced back to about World War II, when certain rent reductions came in, and then they were bolstered in the 40s and 50s. But by the 1960s, they also allowed people, so rents are pegged to certain values, but they're also fixed to those values. So you have values from the 1940s and 50s that are still being paid today, but inflation has really made them meaningless. And especially in Egypt, where in a good year inflation is 10%. So you can imagine how big a disparity these values are today. Another amendment that was made in '69 allowed the deeds to be bequeathed to heirs of the original tenant. And originally, this didn't put a limit to how many tenants, how many generations it would be bequeathed to, but this was stopped to one generation. So you still have homes where two generations have lived in, and the owners aren't able to use them. So I think it's a flawed rent control that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. We also have another question here from Pakinan. The question is, are there any institutions in Egypt working on the affordability of the housing?
There's very, very little, especially that I know of, and some big NGOs have tried to address it, but not through affordability, but maybe through upgrading existing rural housing, either rebuilding some of the housing, hooking it up to water pipes or sanitation pipes. Um, but on a civil society level, and maybe at the national level, there isn't a big effort, unfortunately.
And would you say that there are any best practices from around the world to solve the housing problem?
um,
Some, the ones that you have been able to research, or do you think that that's one of the questions that has been posted as well?
well, the best practices would be to apply a social element to housing policy. This would take care of a lot of problems overnight. Because since the 1970s, it's been the business element that has been taking precedent on the house. And as long as that is there, and as long as the market is deregulated, there is no chance for affordability. And deregulated, I mean, even compared to supposedly very unregulated markets like Britain or the US, Egypt is much more deregulated than they are. So you can imagine where we need to start.
Thank you very much, Yahya. You've managed to keep 75 people online. I guess
Yeah.
they're pretty interested. We have tried to read everything, all the questions and comments that you have included. And I don't see new ones coming in. So if nobody else writes something right now, I think we're gonna end the webinar. And before we do, just want to thank you once more. And we have been very lucky to have you back in Netherlands in 2018 and sharing all your information with the IHS alumni, and then also today in this webinar. So we appreciate that you accepted our invitation to be part of this series for 2020. And thank you to all of you who joined and who were so active in the group, and for sending your messages that you have liked and you have found interesting, and that you will be buying Yahia's book. So thank you, and thank you on behalf of the IHS Alumni Board. Thank you to Eduardo. Thank you to all the board who joined, Mansi, Justin, Charm, Stefana, all the IHS members who make these kind of webinars happen. So thank you all. And Eduardo, please close on behalf of the board.
Okay, thank you guys. Thank you everybody for connecting and to talk to us and to see the comments and the interaction in the chat. It's really good to see the people really interested, like Janu explained. Here is the Yahia's contact information, so feel free to contact him. And like I said, we will post the replay link on our blog. Okay, Yahia, do you want to say something for us to?
Yes, of course. Well, thank you, Jano, and thank you, Eduardo, for also the going over the glitch in the beginning and being patient with all of this, and thanks for everyone who hung in there. And thank you to the IHS for making this possible. I think it's a great platform, and I hope to be invited again.
Yeah, we will be glad to have you. And for all of you out there and you're interested in seeing more of our webinars or check the previous ones, go into www.makingcitieswork.net. Check our Facebook also page, IHS Alumni, and also IHS Facebook and website. You'll get tons of information of upcoming short courses, master's degree, webinars. All the information you want is there if you're into the urban context and become art from different professions that are linked to the urban world. We highly encourage you to visit us and check out. You will find something that interests you there. So everybody have a good rest of your day, evening, and thank you for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.